Thank you very much. And James has asked me to give his apologies as well. But if you don't know James, I've just put a picture up of James, looking very handsome. And I'll also have James in the top left-hand corner of the screen whenever I'm talking as if I was James. Can you hear me at the back, by the way? Just. I'll try and project. So there's James. He gives his apologies. James was responsible for the archaeology here, and my part of the talk is the introduction to King Arthur's Hall, and then the consideration of what the results of the archaeological investigations might mean. So there's where King Arthur's Hall is. I think I'm looking for it. You can see Bodmin Moor. We're about here. And on Bodmin Moor, we're in the northwest sector. King Arthur's Downs and the hall itself is there. I'll probably not refer to it very much as King Arthur's Hall. Next, please. As you can see, I've put the king in brackets. It's actually only in the last couple of hundred years that it's been known as King Arthur's Hall. Before that, it was simply Arthur's Hall. There's an aerial photograph of it. I imagine that many of you have been there. I don't know whether you could put your hand up if you have. Should we do the other way? Anybody not been to King Arthur's Hall? Oh, there are quite a few. Huh? Well, I hope you find it interesting enough to make your way there. It's quite a trek, but it's a fairly easy walk. You park near the Delank Waterworks most conveniently to get to it. So this is an aerial view, directly above, vertical aerial view, and you can see that it's an enclosure within an enclosure. So it's inside a fenced area, but it's a large monument. It's 48 metres north to south, 21 metres east to west internally, and by that I mean between the two faces of the sides and the ends, and those ends are delineated by standing stones. You can see that then that it's oriented very precisely, it seems, to north, south, east, west, which may be significant. It's made up of banks. They're big banks, 10 metres wide, that's twice the width of this room virtually, and 2 metres high, that's taller than me. And there are no ditches around it. So the material to build the bank clearly comes from within, because the area inside the enclosure is significantly lower than the land outside. It's probably cut down to bedrock. It may have been paved, somebody believed. We'll come to that later. The granite slabs around the inside faces are up to 1.75 metres high. That is about my height. 56 of those survive, but you can predict that there would have been around 140 of them if they were more or less contiguous originally. There seems to be an entrance in the southwest corner, but we, in the end, don't believe there is. So you have to imagine it without an entrance, really. Inside, I think you can see there's a marshy pool. Now, peat, it may have once have been a pool, and it's up to 2 metres deep in places. You can't see from this picture, but there are great views to the northeast towards Router, which I'm sure you all know is the most important place in the world. It's in an area of extensive rough grazing, and it's on the boundary between Hamertethy to the north and Blisland Manors to the south. Blisland-Hamertethy boundary is that bank. So it does seem to be closely related to that. And there is a leat, which is very difficult to pick up on this picture, but essentially it starts around here and curves past the hall and runs alongside these banks. And we'll look at that later because it is significant. Finally, it is one of the very first archaeological sites to have been recorded by an antiquarian, by John Norden in 1584. There he is, John Norden. He recorded it in two ways. He described it as Arthur's Hall, and he drew it as Arthur's Hall, and there's his plan to the northeast of the hall itself. And you can see it's a pretty good plan, considering he made it in 1584. So he's showing the more or less contiguous stones, he's showing the bank outside them, and he's showing the pond. And he describes it as this: Arthur's Hall, a place so called and by tradition held to be a place whereunto that famous King Arthur resorted. A square plot, square being rectangular, on a plain mountain wrought some 3 foot into the ground, and by reason of the depression of the place there standeth a stang, or pool of water, the place set round about with flat stones in this manner as he's drawn. So that's one of the very first descriptions of any site in Cornwall. Next one, please. It's been therefore known of and recorded for 450 years or more, but I've put some quotations on the screen from archaeologists and topographers over the last 150 years, all scratching their heads about King Arthur's Hall. So, Sir John Maclean in 1873, it's difficult to conceive for what purpose this work could have been constructed. Lewis, an archaeologist, 1895, very extraordinary. Problematical, curious, said Hugh Henkin, who wrote the first detailed archaeology of Cornwall. MacArthur, in his brilliant book, The River Foy, if you know that, you'll remember this, so strange an enigma, a complete mystery. Dorothy Dudley, said to be unique in this country. And John Barnett, who some of you will have read, said of unknown date and function. And John normally was able to ascribe sites both dates and functions, but he couldn't for King Arthur's Hall. Next. And it continues. So more recently, these are taken from, it's been cut off at the bottom, unfortunately, from one of these, I think it's Megalithic Portal, or one of those sites where people discuss prehistoric monuments. So someone has said, and I'm afraid I can't tell you who, because it's been cut off, if it really is a Neolithic or Bronze Age monument, then it would seem to be almost unique and not correspond to any of the standard categories. I won't read everything else there, but that's the key element. It isn't almost unique, it is unique. It's a one-of-its-kind type site. I found a photograph in the Charles Wolfe archives taken a couple of years after I was born, so almost as old as me. That's what the hall looked like in 1959. Much more open than it is now, and the grazing of the hall itself and the land around places it more clearly in its grazed landscape. Many people have examined it over the centuries. Can you still hear me? Am I clear? Yeah. Yeah. So we've seen John Norden, and I'm not giving you everybody, I'm doing a selection of people here. Essentially those who have changed the direction of understanding most substantially. So Dr. William Bollez, who you may know, he was the first great antiquarian of Cornwall, visited the site and scratched his head as well. We'll come on to a quote from him later. Lewis, who was an antiquarian and an anthropologist, prepared a really good plan, which we'll see later as well, and also suggested several interpretations. He was quite a functionalist, and he was the first to suggest that it was either an animal trap or an animal pound. The Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould, Onward Christian Soldiers, was also an archaeologist, and he dug many sites on Dartmoor, but he occasionally strayed over from his Devonshire home into Cornwall, and he dug King Arthur's Hall. Little known excavation. He didn't report on it, didn't publish it, but it was mentioned by somebody, and I'll come back to him later. Pete Herring, him, and this is what I looked like when I first went to King Arthur's Hall. Very different, sadly. So I first encountered the hall in 1982, and I've been wandering around it and going back to it and pondering it ever since. Shortly afterwards, two people who became my close colleagues at the unit surveyed it again, produced a really detailed earthwork survey and profiles, Pete Rose and Adam Sharp. Jeanette Ratcliffe got involved because the Southwest Water Pipeline ran beside it, and that allowed us to investigate banks and leats close by. Then the time seekers became interested in King Arthur's Hall around about 10 years ago now. Roy Gaute, top right, I think it's fair to say became obsessed with it, and maybe Stuart, you would agree that you are as well, Stuart at the back of the room? Totally obsessed, in fact. And Malcolm Wright was one of their team. These are the Time Seekers, which is a group of archaeologists and enthusiasts who care particularly for the monuments of Bodmin Moor. Malcolm Wright is a geophysicist, geophysicist, that's right, and did a geophysical survey of the hall and its surroundings. And then we come to the more recent excavations and investigations with James, there at the bottom again, but also Tim Kinnaird, who's actually in that picture on the right, the bottom one, but he's, I'm afraid, underneath that black plastic rag, taking his samples because you're not allowed to allow the sunlight to reach you. Sam Turner, standing and glaring at me, is Professor Sam Turner from Newcastle. And in the bog itself beyond is Rob Batchelor taking samples of the peat. And finally, I've got Carolyn Kennett here in the front row, who helped place the monument in its cosmological context, and we'll come on to some of that later. So the 22 people or more, and therefore 22 suggestions over nearly 450 years as to what King Arthur's Hall might be. Because everybody realised it was peculiar, unique, and therefore you can't do what archaeologists always do. Our shortcut is always to look for something similar that we know more about and then attach our interpretations to the understanding that we have from those other places. Here we don't have that, so people are relying on thinking and looking at the site, looking at its fabric, its form, its position, its orientation, its associations and so on, and they've come up with this long list of possibilities, which I've grouped as far as I can into themes. So many people think it's a ritual or ceremonial site, a place of worship, someone said, heathen temple, said a Christian in the 19th century. Or for dealing with the dead, was it a crematorium or was it a mortuary enclosure? We'll come on to those again later. Was it a gathering place, a meeting place, a court of justice? Was it for observing the cosmos, an astronomical observatory, people have suggested, or a calendrical device because of the orientation of it? Did people actually live in it? Some people wondered. Was it really a hall, for example? Or was it an enclosure which contained several houses? Or was it even a town, somebody suggested. Some of these are less likely than others, as you can see. Is it a defensive site? It's quite substantial, although it's vulnerable because it's got a gentle ramp on the outside and steeper inside. Someone thought it might be a fort, Roman fort, because of its shape. Could it be for trapping animals? You can drive them over those banks and then they couldn't get out because there is no entrance. Could it be instead an animal enclosure where you've impounded animals that shouldn't be on the grazing lands around? That was my idea, I'm afraid, although I'm not giving up on it. Could it have been a store, particularly for turf, for the peat that would have been cut on the downs around? Or could it have been a different kind of store, a store for water, a reservoir for feed for livestock, or a reservoir for industrial works, stream works? Next one. Or could it be something else again? We've already got 22 ideas, but there could be more. I'm sure that you've got your own ideas. Or could it be several of those at the same time? Or could it be several of those at different times? In other words, made for one thing and reused for another. And the other thing that people have thought about or guessed, more likely, is how old it is. So some people have thought it was as early as the early Neolithic. That would be about 6,000 years ago. And going to the furthest extreme, later medieval, we know that it was there in 1584 because we have John Norden's account, so it can't be later than that. But it may not have been very much before that, and we've got virtually every period in between. It is a scheduled monument. Even though we don't know what it is or how old it is, we can be sure that it's important, I think. So because it's important, it's been regarded as nationally important and therefore scheduled. It's a scheduled monument. Historic England, who oversee the scheduling and also the condition of those sites, have had King Arthur's Hall on the Heritage at Risk register for several years. Its condition, as you can see towards the bottom, is generally satisfactory, but with significant localized problems, particularly the growth of firs and other scrub, which is causing some damage by the roots, and there is also erosion and actually some rabbit burrowing as well. So its trend is declining, and because of that, it was included in the project that Kathy mentioned at the beginning, Monumental Improvement, which is where the Cornwall National Landscape team, before that the AO&B team, have got national lottery and other funding to bring 40 scheduled monuments that are in poor or declining condition into good condition, and the hall, King Arthur's Hall, is one of those, and all the others are those dots, mainly on the coast, but a few more on Bodmin Moor. And there were further changes suggested or mooted. I don't think I've ever used the word mooted in my life. You normally only see it on headlines in local newspapers. Do you ever say mooted? You do? Wow, I've never said it before. I wrote it, but now I've said it. So they were thinking of removing the fence. If it was decided or discovered that the site was robust and, I guess, of less importance, they may have opened it up to the risk of large animals like cattle and ponies grazing it and eroding it further. I think it's not a spoiler to say that it is important and that isn't going to happen. So anyway, to make those sorts of decisions, we need to understand the site better. And that's what the project was about. And this is James's section. So there's James in the top left. And this is an aerial view taken from a drone looking across the site during the investigations, which took place in September 2022, so 2.5 years ago, looking across King Arthur's Hall, and by doing that, placing it in its wider landscape context. So you can see the two great mountains of Cornwall, Routor in the middle, Bronmanelin or Brownwilly on the right. And you can see an excavation trench, and you can see activity elsewhere. Excuse me. So there are people excavating here, and they also excavated here and here, but principally here, in an area that was already partly damaged by animal erosion. So Historic England had to give scheduled monument consent, because it is a scheduled monument, for any works to the monument, like excavations. And they were reluctant to do this, actually, even though the project was intended to improve the condition, because it's so significant. But they did, in the end, concede that the excavations could take place where it was already damaged and where the excavations, therefore, would cause less additional damage. And so James and his team did various works preparatory to the excavations. First of all, they improved the condition of the monument by cutting back the firs, and the Time Seekers, Cornwall Archaeological Society, and many others helped in this work. So I think that's James himself, probably is, cutting back the firs. And then Anthony Angove, colleague of James, helped him survey the site, and I got involved as well because I was able to see the leat that nobody else could see, because it's an extraordinarily subtle feature, and it was my leat. So we'll see that again later. He did other things too. He commissioned Callum Beeson from the Camborne School of Mines to do a very interesting piece of work where he was looking at the qualities of the granite. So if you look at granite, you can see the feldspar and quartz and mica crystals, and you can make a record. You can use a little square like this, 10 centimeters by 10, and photograph it, and then count the numbers of crystals, and you can get a sense then of where it came from. So, and to show the results of this, the stones in the hall at King Arthur's Hall are here in red dots. The stones on the moors around, or rocks or bedrock, are in the yellow dots within this polygon. And nearby you have other granite outcrops or other granite sites, like the Fernacre Stone Circle. Those stones fit there. The eastern circle, I think, is the King Arthur's Downs Circle, or now the Emblance Downs Circle. Loudon Hill Circle. You can see they've got quite dense and tight clusters in the results. And the overlapping here of these two indicates that the stones used in King Arthur's Hall all came from near King Arthur's Hall, which may sound obvious. But in fact, if you do other circles, not shown on this slide, but the hurlers, for example, the 3 stone circles at the hurlers are comprised of stones which come from 3 different places. So they could have brought the stones from a meaningful place to add meaning to the site itself, but it doesn't seem that they did. Next one. And now we're looking at the detail of what James and his helpers did. So we have the plan that was submitted to Historic England for permission, scheduled monument consent, saying what we intended to do and essentially why. So I don't know if you can see this, it's a bit blurry, but that says eroded area. So we've decided to put the trench where it was already eroded. They gave us permission to do that. There's a standing stone, one of the slabs has fallen, so the idea was to investigate that, see if we could find out more about the standing stones. Malcolm Wright of the Time Seekers had done a geophysical survey I mentioned, and here are some extracts from that placed in relation to the hall. They look like they might be either roundhouses or cairns, so we put some trenches in to test that. And another geophysical anomaly seemed to be a concentration of stones, so we investigated that as well. And there was another one out here, and I can't remember why, but we looked at that as well. When I say we, that's the royal we. I didn't do it. Stuart did it. Okay. Oh, and another view of us doing all of that. So that's this other trench. I think it was another geophysical anomaly. Okay. And these are pictures of the people at work. So these are a mixture of time seekers, that group that works on Bodmin Moor, and I think some Cornwall Archaeological Society members, although it looks pretty time seekery to me. And here there's a mixture of both Cornwall Archaeological Society and time seekers. Okay. And we did we did a detailed and proper excavation. So most of the people were volunteers, but they were overseen at all times by James and by Ant and by other professional archaeologists. So everything was done very carefully and correctly and very minutely recorded, so everything that was unearthed. Because archaeology, excavations that is, destroys as well as finds, we know that the site is going to be damaged, so we're obliged to record it completely as we do the work. So sub-centimetre accuracy. Okay. And here are a few views showing it going down, and you can see that beneath what looked like a fairly soft bank from a distance or from walking over it is actually a really hard structure and a very carefully created structure with lots of slabs which from some angles look like they're higgledy-piggledy, but in fact they are carefully placed, and they're placed one on top of the other in what you might regard as a respectful way. The other thing that became clear as we went down below the stones is that it did what we hoped it would do and sat on a buried soil. I say with that because it isn't certain that a monument is on buried soils, because some monuments in Cornwall, the people who made them cleared the soil almost like to create a foundation and went down to the subsoil, a more stable soil to build a monument on. We were hoping that they hadn't and that we would catch the soil that was there before the monument was built, because that's crucial for the dating. And fortunately, that is the case, as you can see. Thanks. It's a general view along the trench, so we were also extending it this way beyond the bank. There's the bank, so the bank ends about here. You can see some stones from it. Beyond it, we were hoping to cut across the leat as well, which is why the trench was extended this far. But you can see, I think, the fabric of the bank is much stonier behind the standing stones on the inner face, and then more earthy beyond. So it did seem as if they wanted to reinforce that inner face. And here's a section drawing at the bottom, but a photogrammatic image of it above. So that's composed of numerous photographs and made to work in a perfectly vertical and horizontal way. So that you have a perfect photographic record there and a carefully drawn, drafted record below. So you can see the fabric of it more now. This is the inner face, and you can see the stones are concentrated there, and you can also see that they are carefully placed, even though they're all on a slant. They're not thrown in any old way. So that one there, I'm pretty sure is a slumped one from above, and it isn't placed like that originally. And then in the drawing below, I don't know if this is very clear to you, but you can see the drawing of the section and then a number of coloured circles. These coloured circles represent this sampling by the optically stimulated luminescence dating team. I'll call that OSL from now on, if you want. But I'll explain how it works in a minute. But they're the crucial members of the team, really, because they've got the scientific dating that doesn't depend on carbon, doesn't depend on radiocarbon dating. So what they do is they took 90 samples in all, but in a number of columns. And the idea there is that, I think if you go to the next one, if you can remember that, they take a sample in the field, and Sam here has a machine here attached to a computer which tells him the initial results of the optically stimulated luminescence dating. You can read it now. Optically stimulated luminescence. By taking 90 samples in columns, you can, in the field, identify the most significant places of change in the monument. And then you can target your proper samples. I think they took 7, I think. Remember, we'll see in the next picture anyway. From these arrowed points. They selected these because these are places in the bank or beneath the bank which are most archaeologically significant. I don't think you need to understand everything that's on the screen, so I don't. I just copied it. So here are the sampling points, these little red dots. So here we're looking at dating something that might have been associated with the leat, which is in this area, but all the other ones are either embedded within the bank, these top two in particular, or are beneath it, these two here. And these squares are slightly different. They're samples of the organic material. But the OSL dates are these 5 actually, not 7. And you can see that we'll be able to date the fabric of the bank itself, but also the 2 layers of the buried soil beneath. Now, I've got to... Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you tell me the significance of the white line going from left to right horizontally?
I can't. I think it's what we call an artifact of the photography. I don't think it's a real thing. I think it's helping the person who's stitching together the numerous photographs make sure that it's all stitched together properly. Yeah, I think it's certainly not an archaeological feature, no. So optically stimulated luminescence, I don't know if any of you know what it is. Can anybody put your hands up if you know? It's really important for me. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you. Because to me, it's like magic, but in fact, it's real science. So correct me if I'm wrong, you two, but I think it's particularly the quartz elements in the soils absorb the radiation from sunlight when it's exposed to the sunlight, and it stops radiating when the sunlight is taken away. For example, if you are a quartz crystal here at the surface of the bank, you're receiving sunlight until the moment that the people in whatever period built this started to cover you up. So you stopped radiating then. So the people in the clever people in the universities take the sample, which includes you, take it back to their lab, and then expose you to light again, and the speed or the slowness by which you return to a normal radiating level gives you a precise date by the time it takes, and the time it takes is microseconds, but those microseconds can be measured and then multiplied up to give you the distance in time from when you last saw the sunlight. Does that sound like...
Quite close, yeah. It's quartz and feldspar.
Quartz and feldspar.
Once they're buried and they're away from light or heat,
Yep.
they absorb background radiation, so effectively cosmic radiation.
Yeah.
And it's only so the people that collect the samples have to be in the dark.
Yeah.
It comes out in the dark. Once it's exposed to light or heat, it releases that radiation in a burst.
Right.
And that can be measured in obviously.
That's the measuring of that burst. Did you hear that? Pretty much supports, but it's a bit more complicated, surprisingly, than my description. Is that okay with you, Stuart? Yeah. I apologise. It sounded, first of all, that I didn't know what I was talking about, and that I was patronising you all. So it's really because I don't understand it. Really, it's one of those scientific things like radiocarbon dating, actually, that you have to trust if you're an archaeologist, because we're using this increasingly, but unless you're a nuclear physicist, you don't really understand it, I think it's fair to say, as an archaeologist. But we totally rely upon it. So we've relied upon it, so now I need to tell you the results. It's Middle Neolithic. So these are the representations of the results. These are dates, that's 3000 BC, 3500 BC. So the peaks in these two models for the two buried soil elements are pretty much around 3100 on average. That's BC, that's not a Cal BC or anything like that. This is simply BC, the number of years before Christ. So we've summarized it, or Dr. Tim Kinnaird and Professor Sam Turner have summarized it here. The subsoil beneath the bank is dated to 3010 plus or minus 280 years BC. Do you remember we took some samples from the bank itself, and those also produced a Middle Neolithic date, 3070 plus or minus 300. You may think, well, that's earlier than that. But the overlaps of the plus or minus, these are the deviations, mean that clearly they're both more or less the same date. So the buried soil ceased to be open to the sunlight at about the same time that the bank was made. And it was made ridiculously early from most people's point of view. And it's certain, it's not debatable. And just to triple check that, we got some of the samples from beneath the bank radiocarbon dated, and those radiocarbon dates, I can't say they supported these dates, but they didn't not support these dates, if you see what I mean. They didn't contradict it. If we'd got a radiocarbon date of, say, 1000 BC, then that would have made us worry, but they didn't. So they seem to be fine. Next. We did get radiocarbon dates from the work done by Rob Batchelor, who's one of these people, putting in deep cores into the peat inside the monument. So these are the points where they cored, all of them, so nearly 45. There is 45 cores, and they sampled the deeper ones of those and took the samples and radiocarbon dated those. So you use organic material for radiocarbon dates. It's another magical thing, but it's been around for longer than OSL, so I think archaeologists are more comfortable with it. And in fact, many archaeologists hearing our results here kind of panicked at the earliness of it and said, oh, we must get radiocarbon dates to confirm it. So they did that underneath the bank and didn't not confirm it. And they also did radiocarbon dates of the peats within, which they weren't going to do. But once we had the really early dates for the bank, it felt prudent to use the cores that we had from the interior to not confirm, but to double check in some ways. So we've got two dates. One is from near the edge of the interior and one is from the very heart of it. These are the sections that Rob Batchelor's cores produced, and the dates that we have are from the very bases of these cores. And they're really interesting in themselves. We'll talk mainly about the Neolithic ones in a moment, but we do have one from, as labelled here, the late Iron Age, which is approximately, well, it says there, the third century rather, BC. And then we've got one from what we call the early medieval period, which is the pre-Norman period, but it may run into the Norman period, so from 1030 to 1200 AD. Okay. I can't remember whether I said anything about this, but the investigations elsewhere, these anomalies, geophysical anomalies, in the end didn't produce any archaeological material. So those anomalies seem to be geological or natural rather than archaeological. But we have confirmed that, which is useful. And that was also the case with the one out here. And finally, I should say that the investigations here looked at the entrance, or the possible entrance, and confirmed that it wasn't an entrance, that the stones continued, if I can draw on this with my stick, they created a good corner, or you could project them to create a good corner, and that this apparent entrance was caused by people in relatively recent times, but still maybe medieval, cutting through to allow the water within the hall to escape, possibly for animal welfare reasons, because cattle and ponies or sheep might have been drowning in the peat. Okay. What might it all mean? I have to say, I don't know. I hope you haven't come to hear what it all means, because although we've got more information now, it's made it, if anything, even more mysterious than it was before, because that date of construction was so much earlier than most people expected, and not everyone. Some people did suggest it was as early as that. I think you might be one of those, Stuart. Yep, indeed. Yep. But it still meant that we had to think about how this monument sits in one of the earliest periods of Cornish prehistory, the Middle Neolithic. So here we go, Kathy, if you could. Thanks. So to summarise, we have these dates. The construction of the bank, and therefore the hall, is Middle Neolithic. I've broadened it out to 3,500 to 3,000 BC from the OSL dates. But it was also reused because the peat had been churned up, or something had happened in later prehistory, Iron Age, and also in the medieval period. So what I've done is I've taken those as dates 1, 2, and 3. The fourth date is Norden's drawing. So by 1580, it was pretty much as it still is. So it was definitely disused by 1580 AD. Okay. So date 1, creation of the bank, Middle Neolithic. So what was Bodmin Moor like in those days? My feeling, from looking at pollen analyses and so on, is that it was probably not unlike what it is now. So relatively open, grazed, long views, particularly to router, and also capable of seeing the sky. We do also have evidence from Bodmin Moor of woodland, probably wood pasture, in other words, sort of scattered trees rather than dense forest. But it is also that likely, therefore, in some people's minds, that there was a wooded landscape and you wouldn't necessarily have had long views. And it could even be that a place like the Hall, with potential for shelter from the banks, may have been particularly treed. So it could have been shrouded by trees. evidence is unclear. One of the aims, so what's happened now, I should have said this, is that we have a mysterious site still. So we're thinking, well, what else can we do to find out more about it? One of the things we're hoping to do is investigate the peats a bit more, to see what the vegetation was like in later prehistory in the medieval period. But Rob has taken samples from a bog nearby, and we're hoping that that will give us a deep core of peat that we can then analyse to see how the vegetation was changing from before the hall was built, during the period the hall was in use, and then subsequently. So that would help us understand whether it was open or treed. That would certainly help in our interpretations of the site. But say that it was open. I think most people would want it to be open, I think it's fair to say, for most of the interpretations of the hall. It would be only kept open by people farming it, or farming the landscape, grazing it, in other words, as they still do, and as it seems they have continued to do from the period before the hall was built. So for several thousands of years, Bodmin Moor has been grazed. The least grazing has occurred to it probably in the last 50 years, in that long period of several thousand years. So it's been kept open by grazing. We know that by this time the domesticated livestock had arrived in Britain, so we had cattle and sheep and goats, probably ponies as well. Because the grasses on the moor are very seasonal, the use of the moor was probably always seasonal. So the long moorland summer, which means from May Day to Halloween, effectively, the grass becomes palatable around about May Day, ceases to be palatable around Halloween. And that's the reason, I think, that those two dates are so significant for our society in Northwest Europe. Next. Second thing we can say, that this is all before metal, so the creation of the monument, the banks, was pretty much by hand and using organic tools like antler picks. This is a Bronze Age one from the Carlin Valley down near Deveron or Truro. Using simple tools like that, but mainly using muscle power, they shifted, I've calculated, about 1,600 tons of granite to create the monument. I think from that we can conclude that they cared about it, that it meant something to them. This was a period, we think that we're living in a period of great change, and of course we are, but that millennium, the 4th millennium BC in Britain, may have seen the most substantial change, even if it's not the most varied change, because we did go from a largely wooded, whether as wood pasture or forest, to a largely open landscape through the efforts of people. So they weren't averse to working hard, but nevertheless they put a lot of effort into creating King Arthur's Hall. The people themselves, as far as we can tell, the archaeological investigations elsewhere on the moor in the southwest of Britain and elsewhere in Britain tells us that people were probably not settled. We used to learn at school that in the Neolithic we had the Neolithic revolution, agriculture, settlement and so on, but that is no longer the case. We now see them as still largely nomadic in the Neolithic period, mobile people, but they would probably have gathered together at fixed times of the year to do various things, to meet each other, to do the gathering, but through the meeting to find partners, to meet old mates, friends, family, who may have dispersed through marriage, trading. Did someone say something?
No, I just said just like Cornwall show.
Yeah, very, very, very much, yes. Or story cafes, that sort of thing. Yeah, do some feasting, yeah, have some pleasure, music, poetry, dance, take substances, get out of your mind, that sort of thing.
That doesn't happen at story cafes.
Apparently that doesn't happen, so don't get disappointed. But also dealing with issues, that's something that gatherings do. So if you've got problems in your community, it's when you gather together that you can deal with those issues. At that time though, because of the coming together at fixed places, and King Arthur's Hall might be one of those, you become more fixed in your landscape even while you're mobile. So you have fixed places that allow you to say that you're within a territory. It's also a period of sharing. You couldn't possibly enclose your bit of grazing on the moor, so people were intercommoning, and people were therefore sharing and cooperating and living what we might call communal lives. But was that me that did that? But we also know that my microphone has died. Doesn't.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it's working.
Thanks very much. We have lots of... Can you hear me? Can you? You can hear me because you can hear me, but... No.
Should we push right up?
Can you hear me now? You can hear me because you're hearing me. Can you hear me at the back? I'll have to shout, I think. We know from other sites like Cromlech's and Coit's, which are of the same period or earlier, that people were concerned to deal with their dead respectfully, and also probably had ideologies and religions, or rituals at least, and performed ceremonies. So we might imagine that a place which they created with so much effort might have been used for something like that at King Arthur's Hall. But
Try again.
is it working now? Can you hear me?
I would carry on using it because it will record probably.
Am I being recorded through this or through this?
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So all of that will be in the recording of the talk. So if you want to hear it. Yeah. The problem with thinking about the ideology and the use of the site for ritual and ceremony is that we don't have any comparable sites similar to King Arthur's Hall. A couple have been suggested, actually in the 19th century these were suggested, but they're a long way from St Breward. St Breward is the parish where the hall stands, but they do have some attributes in common with the hall. So next slide, please. Kathy. Sorry. Yeah. Yes. So one of those is this site here. This is at Loch Gur. It's called the Grange Circle. It's, as you can see, a circle, and as you can tell from the name, it's got slabs, quite large slabs, similar in size to those at King Arthur's Hall. It's got the same kind of construction, so those slabs are on the inner side of a broad and high bank, as you can see on the photograph. It also has what might be cosmological associations. So there's a single narrow entrance into the Grange Circle, which is in the northeast, which is where the summer solstice sunrise would send rays into the center of the circle. That has that in common. It's also got a fairly similar date. It's been excavated. It's 200 or 300 years later than King Arthur's Hall. So it's similar-ish, but not very similar. It hasn't got a hollowed center. It's not rectangular. It's similar in scale, because these drawings of the three sites that we're looking at are at the same scale, so that's King Arthur's Hall. So it's a bit bigger, so it's not smaller. But it's a very distant comparison, really, as is Cuno, if that's how you say it, which is a site in Brittany and Morbihan, which is a rectangular stone setting. And here's an aerial photograph of it. So very large stones, if you can imagine the scale and relate it to the hall. These are very big stones, bigger than the stones in the hall. It looks like it's got a bank behind it, but in fact that's vegetation. They're freestanding stones. There's no earthwork, and again, there's no hollowing inside. What it has in common, though, with King Arthur's Hall is the orientation. So that's due north. It's a rectangular structure with east, west, north, south sides. And therefore, you can observe equinoxes at it. But if you go to the next slide. First of all, before we do it, I just mentioned that there are no dates for this site. It hasn't been excavated, and we have no certain dates. But people can see, if you go there today, you can see this, equinoctial sunrises and sunsets, and both winter, and this is all in French, which makes it even more difficult for me. Summer solstices can be identified and observed through the corners. I hope I've represented it adequately. Next slide. But a major problem with this site is that it's actually a reconstruction. And here's a plan of the site before the reconstruction, showing it much more irregular than it now is. And it was re-erected by a person who made this plan to make it work, if you like. Which is a shame, because that otherwise it was a nice parallel with King Arthur's Hall in terms of the orientations and the observations. And another site that's been suggested is the Quadrilatère of Manio, or de Manio, again in Brittany, which has other elements that are similar to King Arthur's Hall, particularly the upright slabs forming a neat rectangle, as neat as King Arthur's Hall, and a date which is almost identical, so early 4th millennium BC, based on the type of pottery that was found. However, there's a major problem here, next slide, in that it's, while broadly contemporary, it's not at all like it, really, because what these stones are the surviving curb stones, or supporting stones, on a massive mound that they were holding in place. So it isn't an enclosure as constructed, it's an enclosure as it survives today. So again, it's a very distant comparison to King Arthur's Hall. Next slide. The most similar, but not terribly similar, are these structures. And I've shown King Arthur's Hall at the same scale to examples of what we call mortuary enclosures, which are quite rare monuments, very early again. They're mainly of the 4th millennium BC, so they're Neolithic. And they're constructed in ways which differ from each other and also from King Arthur's Hall. So none of them has slabs of stones on the inside of a bank and a deeper central area. Most of them have got quite slim, because these are the same scale as these, slim ditches, and they possibly had banks because of the ditch, but we don't know for sure that they had banks. And as I say, none of them has a hollowed centre. A few of them are very different indeed. So this one in Scotland, called a mortuary enclosure, is first of all divided into two, but also is made up of posts. So these are the pits for post holes, or these are post holes. But they are the same sort of date, and a mortuary enclosure must be one of the possibilities for King Arthur's Hall, but not a very certain one. I think that's okay. Next. So if you think of approaching the site from a slightly different direction and think about, well, what else was going on archaeologically, or in terms of the features that people created that survive as archaeological monuments for us to look at in this period, in the 4th millennium BC, on Bodmin Moor, we do have a number of types of site. We all love types of site in archaeology because you can see numerous examples of them. King Arthur's Hall is that really annoying thing, a unique site. But here we have some of the types. So here in the top right, we have a tor enclosure. This is Stowe's Hill, or the Cheese Ring Hill. The cheese ring is just visible there, actually. There's the summit enclosure, which was reused as a pound in the medieval period. But you can see massive enclosure of stony banks, enormous banks. A phenomenal amount of work to create it, and that's earlier than King Arthur's Hall, if we're right in our identification of that. It hasn't been excavated, but it's very similar to ones that have been. That'll be about 3,700 BC. A very large enclosure. You can see these are modern houses at the same scale, so you can get many, many modern houses within that enclosure, and we think they're gathering places for very large communities, or where communities over a very large area gathered together in one place, like the Royal Cornwall Show, as someone said earlier. Yeah, like gathering from all over Cornwall, perhaps. That's at one end of a range of gathering places, because these monuments appear to be gathering monuments as far as we can tell. They have other functions as well. So we go on next to the cromlechs, which is the Cornish term for what archaeologists call portal dolmens, and that's like Trethivi coit. So Cornish people called them cromlechs in Cornish, quoits in Cornish dialect English, and archaeologists tell them that they're in fact portal dolmens, and these are a similar sort of age to these. So the first half of the 4th millennium, so earlier than King Arthur's Hall, but it still stands, as you can see. You can go and visit it. It's looked after by the Cornwall Heritage Trust, in fact, Trethevy, owned by them now as well. These are probably gathering places for local communities. This is a gathering place for a large community. These are scattered in parts of Cornwall in a way that suggests they're at the sort of parish level, whereas this is at the cathedral level, if you like. And we think they're for burial because although we don't get bones surviving in Cornwall, in other parts of the world, Northwest Europe, where you do have bones surviving, you get bones in the chamber beneath the capstone. Quite recently, it's been suggested that the capstone was used for excarnation. That means when someone died, they were placed on the capstone and birds of prey picked their bodies clean, and the bones were then placed inside. So the bones then become the ancestors for subsequent rituals at the site. On Bodmin Moor, we don't get these. Although this is made of Bodmin Moor granite, it's actually off the moor. On the moor, we get prop stones, which are similar in some ways. There's a capstone, which may have been used for excarnation, and nearby, usually, to prop stones, you find chambers, natural chambers, in the tors where the bones may have been stored. There's much more I can tell you about prop stones, but I haven't got time. So the next one I want to show you is the long cairns. This is a long cairn here. It's not a very good picture, a bit murky on this slide, but it's a trapezoidal planned mound of stones with a chamber at one end. This one's on Cat's Hole Tor, other side of Brown Willie from King Arthur's Hall. And there are about 4 or 5 of those now known on Bodmin Moor, but hundreds known in southern England. And we seem to be at the western end of a sort of Wessexy distribution of these sites. But again, they're for placing the bones of dead people, but also presumably for gathering to remember those dead people and think about your ancestors. Finally, we have bank cairns, which are peculiar to Bodmin Moor. This is the best one on Routor. It runs for about 400 metres and is aiming at the tors. It changes direction and aims at all of these tors, and that seems to have been a ritual monument along which you walked as you were thinking about your place in the landscape, and particularly in relation to the giants who would have been regarded as the makers of the tors. And you can see some of the ways that these gatherings worked. I won't read all of that. I think we've gone through them all. So those other monuments on the moor indicate interests that the people who built King Arthur's Hall probably shared and may have been incorporated into the design of King Arthur's Hall. For example, interest in cosmic events. So this is that prop stone that we saw just now, and this is a picture taken at midsummer sunset at the solstice, at the furthest north that the sun sets on the distant horizon. And when it does that, and only on that day, does the sunset get caught in the window made by the supporting stones. That monument, because of various astronomical reasons, we can date to about 3700 BC, earlier than King Arthur's Hall. So the people who built King Arthur's Hall, we can say fairly securely, were interested in the basic cosmological events like solstice, sunrises and sunsets, probably the equinoxes as well, and maybe the way that the stars at night rotate around the North Star or the Pole Star. Therefore, the orientation of King Arthur's Hall, directly north-south, may have been related to the observation of the Pole Star, although it wasn't our Pole Star because of the way the space is just bizarre. I mean, Earth is bad enough, but things keep changing. So the pole star that we have, Polaris, is not the pole star that they had when King Arthur's Hall was made. Thuban, another star nearby, was their pole star. It was fainter than Polaris, so it suggests that maybe the pole star wasn't so important, but that's debatable. The next, please. Another thing that we can tell from those other monuments is an interest in the rocks themselves, and in particular in tors. So this is a photograph from within King Arthur's Hall. There's some of the slabs forming the inner enclosure with the use of a modern lens, you can bring Rautor much closer. So these are the distant tors of Rautor, which you wouldn't have been able to see like that in the Neolithic unless they had things that we were not aware of, like lenses. It's unlikely. But the Tor was there, and they would have known the Tor, had memories of the Tor, and thought about the Tor, the great place in North Cornwall. I say that not lightly. Rautor is the focus of virtually all monument building in eastern Cornwall. It seems to have been as important to us as Stonehenge became to the people of Wessex. So it could be that the use of stones as part of the monument is a way of reflecting back to the Tors. Although I should have said earlier that we didn't manage to date the stones. We've dated the bank and we've dated the peat, but we haven't dated the stones, and that will be a problem for interpretation until we can date those stones. And we are pondering how we can do that at the moment. But one of the things about Tors is that, as you can see from this photograph, they look like structures. They're not, they're geological formations, but we know that because we live in a society where there are geologists who tell us this and we know it. But in the Neolithic, that would still have looked like that and would have needed explaining. So the explanations surely must have involved ancestors, whether they were people or whether they were supernatural, like giants. My belief, quite strong actually, is that they believed in giants and that they were part of the explanations of their world. So by creating a monument with big slabs like this, you're associating yourself with those ancestors and those giants. Next. And a third strand that comes through, and it's based on the form of the monument itself, the fact that you've gone down deep into the ground and created a stang, as Norden called it, or a pool or a pond, is that water might have been significant. Tom Greaves, who's an archaeologist who's worked mainly on Dartmoor, has been identifying what seem to be artificial ponds on the moor. They're not natural in their form. They are used by cattle, as you would imagine, for drinking. They're like the dew ponds that you get in the chalk country. They may simply be dew ponds, Dartmoor versions, but they could also be earlier. And he's seen that many of them appear to be associated with cairns and stone rows and so on, and could be early prehistoric. So it's another possibility is that the people created the pond deliberately. And as I've said here, we might regard these as sacred pools in some sort of way. The water, as you can see in that photograph in the top right, from a pool, a down pool on Black Hill, Mary Tavy on the west side of Dartmoor, reflects the sky in the daytime. It would also reflect the sky at night time. It would, therefore could reflect the moon, and if it was very still, which it very rarely is, I have to say, at King Arthur's Hall, it might reflect the stars even. So it might reflect the sky and therefore contain the cosmos. It's interesting the way that archaeologists reflect their interests. I can't say for sure that John Norden was interested in sacred pools, but he did emphasize the pool aspect of the site in his drawing, compared with A.L. Lewis in the late 19th century, who emphasized the stones. You can see them standing out clearly in black, and he paid little attention to the banks, whereas my colleagues Pete Rose and Adam Sharp emphasized the earthworks, the bank. So, and they saw it as a pound, because I asked them to, so I'm afraid. So the way that we record sites as archaeologists inevitably reflects the way we think about them. So we've got three different representations of the hall, representing pretty much the three different approaches to the site. Next. We're getting towards the end, you'll be pleased to hear. And I have to finish this because I am obsessed with pastoralism and cheese making and transhumance. I have to say that that would have all occurred at the time that the hall was created. So you have to also factor in a more functional use, if you like, of the hall. So all the previous suggestions are that it's some sort of ritual or ceremonial monument, but it might have been a very functional monument, a gathering place for those who are worrying about the effects of grazing, or really, more likely, even by the later Neolithic, worrying about whether there was enough grazing for the animals that they would have had. So we know, for example, that to keep the moor open, as it is today, requires a large number of animals, and we know from the pollen that it has been open for several thousands of years. So we've always had herds of thousands of cattle or tens of thousands of sheep to keep that landscape open. And that would have needed management, rules, people breaking the rules, people dealing with those that broke the rules. And it could be that the hall was indeed, I'm sorry to say this, Stuart, possibly a pound, even when it was created. Shakings of heads, I see. Happy to see those, because I don't believe it anymore either, at least for that early period. But it's a possibility, and it needs to be borne in mind. Next one. So jump now quickly to the later dates, date 2, later prehistory. Well, here I think it really was a pound. It may have been an early prehistoric ritual or ceremonial site, which was a really useful thing to use as a pound. It was a large rectangular area where you could keep animals fairly securely because it had no entrance, and you could then hold them until their owners paid their fine and had the animals released back to them. And that is exactly what happened in commons throughout the world for the last 2,000 or 3,000 years. You had drifts where the animals were rounded up, still happens on Dartmoor and in the New Forest. Those that were not meant to be there were impounded, and then they were released on the payment of the fine. And what's interesting is that we do have drift pounds elsewhere on Bodmin Moor for the medieval and later periods, which seem to be inspired, to me, by King Arthur's Hall. This is of interest. So next slide, please. So we have 4 hundreds which reach up onto the moor. Hundreds are administrative areas. They would have administered the commons. So we've got Trigg, Lisnooth, East Wiltshire and West Wiltshire. They each have a drift pound. There's a drift pound called drift pound, conveniently, for Lisnooth up at Higher Town in Advent Parish. Stowe's Pound, a reused prehistoric one, the early Neolithic Tor enclosure. Crow Pound or Crow Pound near St Neot for West Wiltshire. And there isn't one for Trigg, but King Arthur's Hall is beautifully, conveniently there. So there's this plan of King Arthur's Hall as taken from the early Ordnance Survey map. Next, please, Kathy. And here are the other pounds to the same scale as this. You can see the drift pound at Advent, Higher Town, is almost identical in size and shape to King Arthur's Hall. The next. Crow Pound is a bit bigger than King Arthur's Hall, but again it's rectangular with a similar length to King Arthur's Hall. And the next. And Stowe's Pound, up on the top of the cheese ring's there, as you can see. Large area of it is made redundant by the rocks, so the area of the pound is similar to King Arthur's Hall and the others. So I'm happy with King Arthur's Hall being a pound still, but for that later prehistoric date. Next slide. And then the third date, the early 2nd millennium AD, fits really well with what that leat is about. So the leat ran very close to the entrance, as it now is, to the hall, and then we followed it, surveyed it, and it runs down, empties into a dam or reservoir at the head of a streamworks at Lees, near the Stone Circle, if you know that Stone Circle. A pipeline was cut to take the water from the Delank Waterworks to Lower Moor, near Camelford, in about 1990, and that allowed us to put trenches through the banks and the leats in this area. Next. Oh yeah, this is the streamworks, a plan of the streamworks at Lees. You can see the dam at the top, the leat runs into it, fills up, then you release the water when you're operating the streamworks. Next slide. And the sections through the leats indicate here a very sharp V-shaped channel that was cut into the ground to draw the water along. Now you may remember when we did the section through the hall and where the leat was supposed to be, that there wasn't anything at all like that. So the story is this, that the leat is a runoff water leat over its whole length, that there are 2 phases to the streamworks. Next slide, or next press. Oh, there we go. Next one again. You can see a secondary dam is inside the streamworks. So what the story is, this is my story, is that there was 2 stages to this leat. There was a leat that took runoff water from the moor beyond the hall, beside the hall and east of the hall, and brought it to that big early dam. Pool of water there was carefully released. But then later, the breach was made into the reservoir, which is what it was then used as in the tin stream working era, and the leat itself, with a larger volume of water than it would have had from the runoff, was deepened to give you this sharp profile. Next slide. Did you follow that? And you can see most of this in the landscape. So you can see the banks and features which relate to the pound here, and the hall is actually enclosed within an enclosure which seems to be later prehistoric or early medieval. And then you have the leat I've just been talking about, cutting across those banks, then serving the stone circle. Sorry about this. This is a mistake on my part. Next slide, please. So you can see, and the next one as well. So you can see those 3 periods: prehistoric, the King Arthur's Hall, slightly later than it, but there are cairns and stone circles which are nearby, which might relate to the fact that this is already here. So the emblems down stone circles are a pair of circles. The centres of those circles are aligned with the hall, even though you can't see it. People knew that it would be. There's a stone row nearby. There's a cairn over here, as you can see on the plan, and there are other features nearby. But they're kind of satellites around the hall, and they make me think that I'm wrong about it being an early prehistoric pound, but more likely an early prehistoric monument. But then in the Iron Age as well as medieval, it was a pound, and these enclosing banks are relating to its use as a pound. And then medieval and post-medieval, it's a streamworks and a reservoir for them. So it's got 3 main periods and 3 very different uses: ceremony, impounding trespassing animals, and impounding water for streamworks. Next. And to support the pound one, just briefly, this is the earliest map of King Arthur's Hall. It's very sketchy, but can you see a rectangle drawn with pencil on the original? It's within an enclosure called Penny Park, if you can read that, Penny and Park. So that's an enclosure formed by those banks, and I can tell you that penny was the amount that you paid every year to turn your animals out onto Blisland Common, and this is the boundary of Blisland Common and Hamatethi. So it seems likely that they were showing the pound where you paid a penny if you didn't, if you wanted to turn your animals out, and if you didn't pay a penny, your animals went into the pound. And these maps are shown really only to show that it was known as Arthur's Hall in 1748 and still Arthur's Hall in 1808 when these maps were made. Okay. Getting near the end now. In 1915, Mr. Baring-Gould, who's actually Reverend Baring-Gould, who was then 81 years old, excavated the site. This is according to Wilson MacArthur in that book, The River Foy, in 1948. This is the only record we have of his excavating the site. With the aid of a local farmer, that's what he used to do, he'd get labourers. He was 81 after all. He discovered nothing at all except the surprising fact that about 6 or 7 feet below ground level, the hall is completely paved with smooth granite slabs. The floor has no system of drainage and no entrance could be discovered. So that's really important evidence, which is supported really by the peat analysis inside and also by local dowsing groups who've been and dowsed the site, not for water actually, but they have found springs inside, because dowsers also douse it and ask questions of the site. I don't want to go into that at the moment because I think we'll be distracted if we did. But it does seem to suggest that there is evidence for it having not in fact been paved, but cut down to bedrock. So it was sealed, impermeable, and would have been a really likely pond or pool. And there's a topography created by those corings to show you the depths of the pond. So it's deeper in some areas. I think the spring is supposed to be in this northern part of the hall or pond. My feeling, I'm sure Stuart would be happy to hear this, is that it seems quite possible that it was deliberately made to be a pond. But that's just my own feeling at the moment. We need more work done to confirm that. Next slide. And the next one as well. I think James will appear. There he is. So when we did a press release, this is what James said about it. So he was the director of the excavations, and he was as excited as we all were by those dates. Do you want me to read that? I will read it because some of you won't be able to read it. The King Arthur's Hall project provided a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity using scientific dating to understand more about this unique and enigmatic monument, the main question being, when was King Arthur's Hall built? The job of the archaeologist was to find deposits relating to the building of the monument. Dedicated volunteers spent a week helping CAU archaeologists dig and record a trench cut through the bank, successfully revealing an ancient land surface buried beneath the monument for 5,000 years. We identified sediments buried below and within the bank, and specialists from St Andrews and Newcastle universities took samples for dating. Knowing when King Arthur's Hall was built will help us understand this unique monument form better, how it might have originally been used and how it could have been used over time. It gives us a framework for further questions. For instance, were the stones placed there at the time of building or later in prehistory? How was it used as part of the surrounding landscape? And can we find evidence for later use, such as an animal pound or reservoir? That's James's summing up in the press release. Next one, please. So we go back to Dr. William Borlase, and he says, nearby, he was describing this area of Bodmin Moor in the 1750s, nearby also is Arthur's Hall, and whatever is great and the use and the author of is unknown is attributed to Arthur. That's a practice that people throughout Britain had and still have, I think. So there are lots of Arthur's bed, Arthur's tomb, Arthur's grave, all over Britain. Mysterious monuments, we don't understand them. We attribute them not to giants or the devil or God. We attribute them to the supernatural being that is Arthur. Why are you laughing? It's true. It's true. Yeah, next one. And Arthur himself is a mysterious figure, and he's represented in all sorts of strange ways. So as a warrior here, I think this is actually in southern France, this representation of King Arthur. Next. And in illustration, so a very noble Arthur, very medieval looking Arthur, although Arthur, if we're right, would be much earlier than this, and more recent as well. Next. Like that. A once and future king. Okay. So Borlase was reflecting the way that, and it's still the case, I think, even after I've told you all these things today, that we're still more or less where we were. We still don't really understand King Arthur's Hall. I'm sorry if I've got you here under false pretenses. So, yeah. I won't read you, this is my summary, but it's very similar to James's. Next. So thank you. Thank you to all the volunteers who worked in various stages during the project. Thank you to the Lord of Hamatethi Manor, because it's in Hamatethi land still, and the commoners who gave permission, to Historic England who gave permission, the Monumental Improvement Team, to Ziggy, who's James's dog, so there's James again, represented through his dog. He helped in the backfilling, which turned the monument back to the same form that it was before. Thank you to everyone who cares for the hall, and all of those who have pondered its many meanings, and all of those who've supported the project with funds, expertise, and many kindnesses. Because one of the things about King Arthur's Hall and the project is that of all the projects, 40 of them, I don't think any of them had the same profile because of people's caring for the site and worrying about the site and wondering about the site. And finally, I want to thank the Cornwall Heritage Trust, of course, who supported it in various ways, including funding the dating. That dating was funded largely by the Heritage Trust. So they've had a major effect on it. I think that's pretty much it. So goodbye. And James has given me a little video, so if you press it again, Kathy, it might work. Or it might not. Press it again. there you can see the wind is blowing the grasses, and the drone takes off and flies over the hall. So there we go. Thank you very much.